You made all the right moves. You took the promotion. You bought the house, close enough to your parents, far enough from your old apartment. You know the good neighborhoods, the reliable contractors, the restaurant where everybody knows your name. You're not struggling. You're not reckless. By almost any external measure, you've built something stable. And that's exactly where this conversation starts. Not with what went wrong, with what went right, and what that cost you in ways that don't appear on any statement, any tax return, or any net worth calculator you've ever used. There's a specific kind of financial constraint that doesn't look like a constraint at all. It looks like a good life. The question worth sitting with is this: what if the city that raised you was also, quietly, structurally, designed to consume exactly the income you're capable of producing? We'll come back to that.
There's a term in behavioral economics called status quo bias. It describes the tendency to prefer the current state of affairs, not because it's optimal, but because change carries a psychological cost that feels heavier than it actually is. Most people encounter this in small decisions, but for high-functioning middle-class earners, it operates at the level of entire cities. Here's what it looks like in practice. You grew up somewhere. You built a network there. You learned the unwritten rules: which firms are worth working for, which neighborhoods appreciate, which connections open doors. That knowledge has real value, and so staying feels not just comfortable, but rational. And it is rational, partially. What the calculus almost never includes is this: the local economy you grew up in was not built around your potential. It was built around its own equilibrium. Your employer knows the local cost of living. Your salary was set accordingly. The mortgage you qualified for was calibrated to that salary. The lifestyle you've built was priced to that mortgage. Everything fits, neatly, precisely. That's not coincidence. That's a system functioning exactly as designed. The hidden architecture here is a feedback loop. Your income, your spending, and your geography have co-evolved into a structure that feels like stability, but functions like a ceiling. And because nothing about it is uncomfortable, nothing triggers the kind of reevaluation that discomfort usually forces. That's the mechanism worth understanding. Comfort doesn't prevent ambition, it prices it out. When you can afford a good life where you are, the activation energy required to pursue a structurally different life somewhere else becomes almost impossible to justify, not emotionally, financially. The numbers don't demand it, so the question never gets asked. Comfort is not cheap, it's just built slowly. What looks like a reasonable decision to stay is often a permanent decision made incrementally. One renewed lease, one local promotion, one more year at a time. And each year, the switching cost grows.
At some point in the middle-class financial arc, home ownership stops being a decision and starts being an assumption. You save, you buy, you build equity. It's presented as the most structurally sound move available to someone at your income level. And in isolation, parts of that are true. But there's something embedded in the standard mortgage that rarely gets examined as a financial instrument in the way it deserves. A 30-year fixed mortgage is not just a loan. It's a geographic commitment, signed at the exact moment in your career when your risk tolerance is highest and your options are most open. Consider the structure. In the first years of a conventional mortgage, the overwhelming majority of your monthly payment services interest, not principal. The equity builds slowly. The exit cost, emotionally, financially, logistically, builds quickly. This is not accidental. It's the architecture of the instrument. And layered on top of that architecture is something behavioral economists call loss aversion, the well-documented tendency to weight losses more heavily than equivalent gains. You don't just own a house. You own a renovation, a neighborhood relationship, a school district, a commute you've optimized. Every one of those is a sunk cost that quietly votes against mobility. So when a structurally superior opportunity appears in another city, a wage premium, a different industry density, a market where your skills are genuinely scarce, the calculation doesn't happen cleanly. It happens against the weight of everything you'd be giving up. A mortgage doesn't build equity, it builds immobility. And immobility for a high-functioning earner is one of the most expensive conditions possible. Labor market research consistently documents significant wage premiums in high-density knowledge economy metros, gaps that are not marginal, they are structural. They reflect genuine differences in industry concentration, employer competition, and capital proximity. The middle-class professional who stays local doesn't just forego those premiums once, they forego them compounded, across decades, across raises, across the investment base those additional earnings would have built. The house didn't trap them. The house just made leaving feel like loss. And when leaving feels like loss, most people stay.
Let's pause here. Because everything covered so far, the familiarity premium, the mortgage lock, the slow accumulation of switching costs, could be read as a series of individual mistakes, bad timing, poor planning, insufficient discipline. That reading is wrong. What we've been describing is not a collection of personal errors. It's a system operating correctly. And that distinction matters enormously. Think about who benefits from your geographic stability. Your employer operates in a labor market where your immobility suppresses your negotiating leverage. They don't need to compete aggressively for your skills because the cost of you leaving, the house, the network, the familiarity, is partially doing that work for them. Your lender collects interest on a front-loaded instrument for decades. Your local government depends on a stable, predictable property tax base. The retailers, service providers, and institutions calibrated to your income tier depend on your continued, consistent participation in the local consumption loop. None of these entities conspired to constrain you. They didn't need to. They simply built structures that reward your presence and silently penalize your exit. The system doesn't fear your ambition, it fears your mobility. This is the architectural logic that reframes everything discussed before. The salary that felt like recognition was priced to local equilibrium. The mortgage that felt like responsibility was an instrument of geographic commitment. The comfort that felt like reward was functionally the mechanism keeping you inside a system that required your participation to sustain itself. Satisfaction is a more efficient retention tool than obligation. You cannot negotiate your way out of a contract you don't know you've signed. And here is the deeper structural irony. The more optimized your life becomes within this system, the better your neighborhood, the more established your network, the more senior your position, the more expensive your exit becomes. The system doesn't tighten its grip as you succeed within it. It loosens it because it doesn't need to hold you. By the time you're comfortable enough to leave, you're too embedded to go. That's not a trap. That's a design.
There's a version of this conversation that focuses entirely on money. Salaries, mortgage rates, labor market premiums. But the structural constraint we're examining has a layer beneath the financial one, and it's considerably harder to quantify. It operates through your relationships, not against them, through them. Here's the mechanism. When you grow up somewhere, you don't just accumulate contacts. You accumulate a social position, a legibility. People knew you before you earned anything, before the title, before the house, before the carefully constructed version of your adult life. That history has genuine value. Belonging is not nothing. But it also functions as a pricing system. Your hometown peer group, whether you're conscious of it or not, establishes a reference point for what a life at your income level is supposed to look like. The neighborhood you should be in, the car that signals you're doing well without doing too well, the school, the holiday, the kitchen renovation. Behavioral economists call this the hedonic treadmill, the tendency to return to a baseline level of satisfaction regardless of financial gains, because the baseline itself keeps moving. But in a hometown context, the treadmill isn't just internal, it's socially enforced. The consumption patterns of your peer group becomes the floor of your own spending, not through pressure, through identity. You're not buying a house in that neighborhood to impress anyone. You're buying it because that's what someone like you, in a city like this, at this point in their life, does. Identity-based consumption is the most expensive kind, precisely because it doesn't feel like consumption. It feels like coherence. And coherence, once established, is psychologically expensive to abandon. Capital that could have been deployed differently
invested, relocated, repositioned, gets absorbed into the maintenance of a social standing inside a system with a fixed ceiling. The peer group didn't ask you to spend that way. The identity did. You're not keeping up with anyone. You're keeping up with who you decided to be. And that decision was made, mostly, by the city that shaped you before you were old enough to evaluate it. There's a belief, widely held and rarely examined, that discipline is location neutral, that a sufficiently rigorous person can build wealth anywhere, that the variables are behavioral, spending habits, investment consistency, income growth, and that geography is largely incidental. This belief is not just incomplete, it is one of the most structurally costly assumptions a high-functioning earner can carry. Here's why. Labor economists have documented persistent, significant wage premiums in high-density metropolitan knowledge economies, differences that aren't explained by cost of living adjustments alone. They reflect genuine structural advantages, denser employer competition, higher industry concentration, greater proximity to capital, and the compounding effect of working inside ecosystems where skill is genuinely scarce. The middle-class professional in a mid-tier market isn't underperforming. They're operating in a market with a structurally lower ceiling and optimizing brilliantly within it. That distinction is important because optimization within a constrained system is not the same as evaluating whether the system itself is the right one to be inside. Behavioral economists refer to this as a failure of reference class, the tendency to measure performance against local benchmarks rather than structural alternatives. You're earning more than your peers. Your investments are consistent. Your trajectory looks sound. Relative to the system you're in, it is sound. But opportunity cost doesn't care about relative performance. It measures what the same inputs, the same discipline, the same competence, the same years would have produced inside a different structure. And compounded across a career, the gap between a structurally constrained market and a structurally advantaged one is not marginal. It becomes the difference between two entirely different retirement positions, two different ceilings on investable capital, two different outcomes from identical behavior. The inputs were the same. The architecture was different. Discipline compounds, but it compounds on whatever base the system gave you. Most people never calculate the yield on their geography. They calculate the yield on their portfolio, their savings rate, their investment allocation. The instrument with the highest long-term impact on their financial position gets no analysis at all because it doesn't feel like a financial instrument. It feels like home.
This is not an argument for leaving. Understand that clearly. Mobility is not a virtue. Relocation is not a strategy. There is no structural guarantee that leaving produces better outcomes than staying, and anyone suggesting otherwise is selling something this channel has no interest in selling. What this is an argument for is something more precise: pricing. Every serious financial decision gets analyzed: the interest rate on the mortgage, the expense ratio on the fund, the tax efficiency of the account structure. These are examined, compared, optimized. Geography, the single variable with the greatest structural influence on your lifetime earning capacity, your investment base, and your compounding trajectory, gets selected by default, by proximity to family, by familiarity, by the inertia of a life already partially built. None of those are illegitimate reasons, but they are not financial analysis. A decision made by default is still a decision. It simply has no author. The reframe this warrants is not geographical, it's methodological. Apply to your location the same evaluative rigor you apply to your other financial instruments. Calculate the yield, examine the structure, understand who else benefits from your presence inside it, then decide. Not because the answer will necessarily change, but because a decision made with full structural awareness is a categorically different act than one made inside a comfort you never stop to examine. Where you live is a financial position. Most people inherited it.
We started with someone who made all the right moves. The promotion, the house, the life that, by almost every external measure, looks exactly like it should. Nothing in this analysis changes that picture. What it changes is the frame around it.
because there is a meaningful difference between a life that was built and a life that was absorbed, between a structure that was chosen and one that was inherited, and then gradually, incrementally, made to feel like a choice. The professional at the opening of this conversation isn't a cautionary figure. They're a precise illustration of how well-designed systems work. They don't announce themselves. They don't constrain visibly. They simply make staying feel like the intelligent option, and they do it so effectively that the question of leaving never fully forms. This week, identify one financial decision you've made that you've never analyzed from the outside. Not to reverse it, not to interrogate your judgment, simply to understand whose interests it serves, including and especially your own. The most expensive beliefs are the ones that feel like common sense. You made all the right moves. The question worth sitting with now is a simple one. Right by whose design?